Today we're going to continue our aim training crash course by covering smooth tracking, and I'm going to be teaching you the proper technique so you can track like a pro. If you're new here and looking at the video length, getting ready to click away, do what you want, but I promise you, YouTube is filled with videos talking about how you can become an aim god, but don't actually teach you anything about how to aim. My content actually arms you with the info you need to immediately act on and start improving with no filler or fake promises. As always, I'm going to be giving you recommended scenarios and routines in KovaaKs, FPS Aim Trainer. But don't worry if you don't want to shell out the $10 for KovaaKs, we're going to be covering some Aimlab tasks you can run as well, which is a free aim trainer. Make sure to check the description for timestamps and references. When it comes to sexy clips that people like to see, wide flicks and target switches are high up on the list. Tracking is kind of the unsung hero of aiming in FPS games because when executed well, it looks effortless. But make no mistake, it is a very difficult skill to master. I'm sure you've been in situations in FPS games where you just can't seem to hit your shots even when the enemy is moving in a predictable path. I know I have. Tracking is split into two main categories, reactive and smooth. In smooth tracking, our topic for today, you're primarily developing your ability to maximize your stability while keeping your crosshair on a target. Typically, this is on higher time to kill or TTK targets using guns with a high fire rate, but not always. This also includes your ability to react back to targets' changes in movement and quickly reacquire it to continue tracking it. But of course, targets in smooth tracking situations are more predictable, meaning they don't change direction and speed at a high frequency. So if you're doing the Voltaic or RiddBTW benchmarks, they'll be testing you on your ability to maximize what I call crosshair uptime, which is essentially how long you can keep your crosshair on a target while shooting it. Sounds easy, right? Well, maybe not. There's a lot of fine motor movement and mouse control required to keep your crosshair where you want it, and keeping it both smooth and stable. In FPS games themselves, this technique is super beneficial for minimizing bullet drop-off, so more of your bullets matter, eliminating targets more quickly, preferably before they kill you. It also makes better use of your inventory since you can effectively kill targets with less bullets. It becomes very apparent how useful smooth tracking is when using automatic guns in a mid-range or longer distance because targets become quite small and jitter along with recoil results in far more missed shots. Something that's important to understand is that smooth tracking is an underlying major technique, as important as clicking that you're developing. The foundation you're building here will apply majorly to other aim areas like evasive switching, dynamic clicking, and even static clicking, like when you're doing Pokeball scenarios. So don't skimp on developing the technique in favor of score chasing. For settings in your aim trainer, you'll be sticking with 103 Overwatch Field of View or FOV. There's no real advantage to setting it higher like there is in target switching. For backgrounds, it's better to use textures with lines, like concrete tiles and bricks are really popular at the moment. This helps you better understand bot movement and perceive depth. For sensitivity, you'll be running in your normal range. A good starting point is anywhere between 25 and 40 ACM a rev. You don't want to go too low with your sends like you would with static because some of the smooth tracking scenarios like smoothbot have a decent amount of velocity and angles. Back in the day, people would cheese the benchmarks like thin gauntlet with a super low sensitivity. That's not really possible anymore. Plus, the foundation you're building here will transition into more and more reactive tracking, which will have higher velocity targets and start to penalize you if you haven't built good technique, especially when reacting to bot direction changes. When practicing smooth tracking, it's often recommended to train at a higher sensitivity than you normally play with or are comfortable with. This increases the challenge, makes you create errors, which ultimately helps you improve faster. As a general rule, playing at a higher sends uses more of your wrist and fingertips, and a lower sends will use more of your shoulder and arm. When training smoothness, pay attention to which parts of your arm that you're using that result in jitter and adjust your sensitivity accordingly to focus on those areas. You can use a randomizer here with a significant benefit, almost as good as using one during reactive tracking scenarios. Aimlab has a built-in randomizer. If you want to use one in KovaaKs, you'll need to use a third-party program, which I cover in another video. Word of caution, if you use a third-party tool, there is a chance you'll get banned just for having the driver installed it uses to randomize your sends, so use at your own risk. For technique, when you're starting out, one of the most important things to pay attention to is over-predicting. Over-predicting is basically when you're too focused on the bot patterns and start to preemptively react to target movement changes because you're anticipating them to change direction. What you want to always focus on while training is to assume that the bot will continue in its current direction forever, then wait until you see it change direction and react back to the movement change. That way you're developing your reading and reactivity skills. And while we're on the topic of reacting back to bot movement, it's very important to react back smoothly. By that I mean not flicking too hard and landing in front of the bot like you would in a flick target switching sen. Not only does this waste movement, it will cost you some habit unlearning later on when you move into more reactive tracking. You want your reaction to the target movement changes to feel smooth and relaxed, not tense and snappy. On tension, Aquatic is a top aimer who's going for Nova this year, and he asks I highlight this in smooth tracking, since this will have a major impact on your mouse stability. Tension refers to the force that you apply to your mouse when gripping it, and which muscles are activated will depend a lot on the sensitivity you're using. So you might not notice how tensely you're holding the mouse until you start using higher sensitivities, and become jittery because you're simply gripping the mouse too tensely. So while you're aim training, you want to consciously think about keeping your mouse hand as neutral as possible. A recommended technique is to rebind your mouse 1 to something else like spacebar, so you could feel what a completely neutral position is like in your mouse hand, and then always strive to attain that level of tension, consciously thinking about it when you're aim training. I've also heard people suggest visualizing that you're holding something extremely fragile, like an egg or very thin glass, so you subconsciously hold your mouse delicately because you're worried the thing you're holding will break. Aquatic also suggests if you notice you're tensing in the middle of aim training, don't just restart the scenario, but actively think about relaxing the tension while you're playing this scenario. Over time, this will become more reflexive, meaning it's something that you'll do automatically. But especially at first, or when you're reviewing how to improve at smoothness, think about how tensely you are holding the mouse and how you can minimize it. You also want to be watching the bot and not your crosshair pretty much always when doing smooth tracking. This is because you're partly developing your reading skills, which is essentially your ability to understand how a target is going to move on screen and react accordingly with your crosshair movement. Remember before how I mentioned crosshair uptime? Let's expand on that a bit. When you're training, you want to be prioritizing keeping your crosshair on the target even when it feels jittery. I see way too often players that are slightly in front of or behind the target and still following the same pattern and direction the bot moving, even though they're not doing damage to it. What you want to do is pay attention to when your crosshair falls off the bot and micro correct to bring it back. This is especially true in scenarios like Popcorn Good at Tracking Invincible, also known as PGTI, or smoothbot that have frequent velocity and angle changes. On the topic of resetting your mouse, due to the nature of smooth tracking sends, you're going to be encountering mouse resetting more than the other scenarios. By that we mean physically picking up your mouse to bring it back near the center of your pad when you run out of space. Resetting your mouse is not inherently bad. It happens, and learning how to properly reset your mouse quickly is a skill that you need to develop, because it will happen in firefights, and a good reset can mean the difference between winning and losing. There's two considerations here. One is try not to over reset just because you're on a part of your pad that you're not comfortable with. You want to get comfortable with parts of your pad, wrist, and arm that you aren't used to using. That's why you're aim training. The second is try to reset at a time when it is optimal, like when the bot pattern is the least viable. Remember when we talked about viability in other Crash Course videos? If not, make sure to go back and check those out. Basically, when the target is really difficult to hit anyways, like when its velocity is at its max or near the bottom of the arc with an arcing bot, that's when you want to prioritize resetting your mouse. That's pretty much it for technique with smoothness. This is a really straightforward mechanic that's difficult to master and just requires putting a lot of reps in. So to sum up, don't over-predict. Assume the bot will keep going in its current direction forever, then react back when it changes direction. Pay attention to the bot and not the crosshair to build your reading skills. Focus on smoothly reacting back to bot changes. Prioritize crosshair uptime, micro-correcting when your crosshair falls off the target. Allow yourself to be comfortable with parts of your pad you're not used to, and focus on mouse resetting at optimal times. So now I'll be going through each of the types of tracking scenarios available in aim trainers, which ones are useful to focus on, and what they help develop in your technique. I'm mostly going to be focusing on what I call big compound scenarios that are either very effective at what they isolate or are able to develop multiple adjacent techniques simultaneously. One important thing to note, in kovaaks especially, there's a lot of variations of these scenarios. To increase the difficulty, you could choose smaller bot versions of the scenarios I'm describing. How do you know when to increase difficulty? This is not a hard and fast rule, but shoot for 25 to 30% accuracy before increasing difficulty. Basically, you want to create errors and challenge yourself to the point of frustration during your learning bouts, which will cue your brain's attention to change in order to adapt and improve. On the other hand, if you want to decrease the difficulty, an easy way to do that in KovaaKs is to change the timescale, which is essentially increases or decreases the bot's speed by a flat multiplier. You can change it to 0.7, for example, if it's too difficult at the default number of 1. There doesn't seem to be a way to do this yet in Aimlab, so you can just look for easy versions of the scenarios. For the Aimlab scenarios I'll be covering, easiest way to get to them in Aimlab is to just use Control F to find and type in the name or part of the name of the scenario. So the first type is one plane tracking, like horizontal or vertical tracking. Generally, these are predictable long strafes that help you focus exclusively on minimizing jitter on whichever bot direction you want. These will focus far less on your reading skills and more on your raw ability to consistently keep up with the bot movement and prevent your crosshair from falling off the target. When you're playing these, prioritize thinking about keeping your crosshair on the target center mass as you're following the strafe pattern, and consciously remind yourself to move the crosshair smoothly back to the target whenever it falls off. In KovaaKs, you'll commonly see scenarios like centering, smooth your wrist, vertical long strafes, then gauntlet. I think that revolving tracking is one of the best scenarios per unit time to work on for horizontal, vertical smoothness popcorn, and vertical smooth lapu for vertical training. In Aimlab, look for scenarios like VT thin gauntlet AIO and RA thin aiming long invincible and RA popcorn vertical smoothness. The next type is XY tracking. You'll want to graduate to these scenarios as soon as possible, and it's a very wide area, so I've broken them into different subgroups. The XY in this instance refers to the fact that bots will be moving across at least 2 dimensions, sometimes 3 depending on the scenario. These are some of the most beneficial scenario types you can train on because the bots are difficult to predict and require constant micro adjustments to stay on target. I've been learning a lot about how to optimize skill learning, and one of the mantras repeated is density of reps per unit time, meaning the more repetitions you can execute during a learning bout, especially as you're starting out learning a skill, in this case aim training, the faster you learn the skill. And due to the bot physics and XY scenarios, you will be getting the most amount of dense reps in with these. So you've got the parabola type, probably the most famous or infamous scenario in this is popcorn good at tracking invincible, or PGTI. The Aimlab version of this is called mini sphere Voltaic. Arguably one of the most useful aim training scenarios ever made. This features an arcing bot with very awkward angles near the peak of the jump. If you can withstand the frustration of this scenario, this would be one of the most useful ones that you can play. Bounce 180 Ti is in the same vein. In KovaaKs, there's tons of variations of this scenario, another extremely useful type. You'll find Bounce 180 Ti, also known as B180 Ti, in Aimlab as well, but the same name. I also sometimes see it listed as Arc 180 Ti and RA Bounce Track. The next type is what I just call spheres, which is mostly smooth sphere and control sphere, 2 of the best smoothest scenarios that you can train on. I'd also lump the pass-through track invincible scenarios into this category. In Aimlab, you'll see both smooth and control sphere with the same name. RA also has a version called precisesphere, which is sort of a mix between control and smooth sphere, and I really love that scenario. I kind of wish it was in KovaaKs. Smooth sphere features a longer strafe pattern and more arm focus, while control focuses more on shorter strafes to focus more on wrist and fingertip movements. Pass-through track is more a predictable bot pattern and features more of a diagonal movement with a brief pause between strafes. You'll see tons of variations of the scenario in KovaaKs. In Aimlab, you'll just see it listed as MPXY Invincible. Smoothbot's next. It has an interesting history. It came into prominence back when Sparky, at the time, it's now known as Voltaic, used Thin Gauntlet V2 as a tracking bench, and the community realized that people were gaming the scenario with super low sensitivities instead of actually focusing on improving their aim. Smoothbot then became the de facto replacement, which is much harder to cheese and forces you to develop technique. It features a bot with wide velocity swings, requiring you to use a lot of your mouse pad, and if you try to use a low sends to minimize jitter, you won't be able to keep up with the bot. It's one of the best smooth track sends to work on. In KovaaKs, there's tons of variants. In Aimlab, you'll see it listed with the same name or as Smooth Pill. The last XY type is Glider, and if you've ever played Fortnite, this will be familiar to you, as it replicates the glider you use when landing in that game. It features a smaller, difficult to hit bot with a smooth horizontal strafe, starting high up in the sky and slowly drifting back down to the ground. Not only is this a very practical situation to train, it's excellent for developing your smooth tracking technique. My favorite version in KovaaKs is a pure glider version. You want to focus on aiming for the head to maximize your score, and the only version I can find in Aimlab currently is RA Glider Track. The last smooth track scenario type is what I call reactive smoothness. These are the scenarios where you start to question whether it falls into reactive territory due to the frequent bot changes. changes, but they serve as an excellent bridge to bring smoothness into reactivity, which is incredibly important to develop proper technique. Probably the most important scenario you can play is smooth thin strafes, aka needle track strafing in Aimlab. The important technique to focus on is smoothly reacting back to bot changes. And what makes this scenario so fantastic is its unpredictable strafe pattern, mixing in a combination of long and short strafes. This helps you avoid predicting and forces you to develop smooth reactions to bot changes. Gord is a top aimer and someone I quote a lot, and she refers to proper technique as decelerating and reaccelerating. So instead of quickly flicking to the bot's change in movement, think of it more as decelerating when approaching the target and accelerating after approaching the target. If you spend a lot of time on static but avoided smoothness and tracking in general, this will be a difficult habit to get into, since reading isn't involved in static at all, and your first inclination will probably be to flick fast when the bot changes direction. Another great scenario to practice reactive smoothness is Air Angelic for Voltaic, also known as Angelic Sphere Voltaic and Aimlab. Both of these will be fairly easy to find if you run Voltaic benches, since they are a benchmark scenario. Same technique and characteristic as smooth thin strafes, this just has XY movement and more frequent strafing. As a bonus in kovaaks at least, there's the other category for specialized smoothness practice. Things like oblique and KVA, which features bots that quickly strafe at odd angles and perspectives, intended to replicate the experience of mid-range strafing in FPS games. Or circle smoothness, which, you guessed it, features bots that goes in circles of varying sizes. If I had to make a list of all the best smooth track scenarios to work on, it would be smooth thin strafes, smooth sphere, control sphere, pure glider, smoothbot, PGTI, and revolving tracking. Maybe throw in bounce 180 Ti and popcorn vertical smoothness for good measure. Doing all of these will give you full coverage of all the smoothness tracking acuity you need for FPS games. This section on routines is going to primarily focus on kovaaks. Unfortunately, the equivalent playlist feature in Aimlab is extremely limited and buggy, and there's just not a lot of playlists out there yet. But where applicable, I am going to discuss the equivalent Aimlab custom scenarios you can run. One thing you could do is check out the latest Voltaic fundamental Aimlab routines. They have a detailed routine list ranging from absolute beginner to around intermediate, and they'll be putting out advanced routines later. All the routines I'll be covering can be run in a one-by-one fashion, meaning you can run each scenario once and run the routine multiple times, and you can just play them in total random order. The first routine, definitely the most popular and well-known, is PureG smoothness, and with good reason. It's a phenomenal routine with pretty much full coverage of all the smoothness types I just described. It's got centering and vertical smoothness popcorn, it's got smoothbot, it's got gliders, bounce 180 tracking invincible, it has the hardest thin gauntlet bots. It's got it all really. Two of the best scenarios in kovaaks are on this playlist, tam target switch smooth and control. These are also available in Aimlab, by the way. They feature the same bot pattern as Smooth and Control Sphere, except they have bots that regenerate health, and there's more targets to choose from, so it's more akin to a target switching scenario. If you're going to run one smoothness routine only, this is the one for you. Note that there are multiple variants of this routine, basically just increasing or decreasing the difficulty, so I'll provide share codes and kovaaks in the YouTube description for all of them. Next you have Lapu, who put together some great smoothness routines. He's a grandmaster in kovaaks with over 3,000 hours in aim trainers and counting, and is just really good at putting together succinct and effective routines. There's two main routines he put together, each having 3 difficulties of easy, medium, hard, which essentially just features smaller bots with the harder versions. The first one is titled Varied, and you guessed it, it has a variety of smoothness scenarios. I just covered my opinion on best in breed smoothness sends, and the Varied routine has pretty much all of them, so just run this if you want all of the best compound scenarios. Good news is nearly all of these scenarios are also available in Aimlab. They're just that good. The XY routine he put together includes the KVA and circle track scenarios I mentioned earlier. They are interesting and fun to play, not to mention cover aim components you don't often see featured. I really like the smooth vert and vert smooth scenarios for having unusual momentum swings. They feel buttery to play and help prevent you from zoning out while training. Finally, the pass-through track smooth is excellent for smoothness training in all directions without feeling too much like like a passive training scenario. Voltaic's smoothness routine is also quite good. They have an easy and intermediate version which generally feature variations of the same scenario types we've already covered. The exception being they focus a lot more on air type bot movement and smaller, more precise dots, like with the RiddBTW XYZ scenarios, which are fantastic for building up your wrist smoothness. If pure density of similar scenarios are your thing, look no further than Fallen smoothness routines. They feature tons of variations of most of the scenarios we've already discussed, intended to be played in a 1x1 fashion. He suggests running them at 1.1 to 1.3 times your normal sensitivity, similar to what we discussed earlier on my section of settings. It's not a RID video without a common mistakes section. So the first is overtraining smoothness. This was super prevalent in the AIM community to just diagnose every single VOD review as a smoothness problem. Unclean lines and static, smoothness. Slow target switches, smoothness. Poor reading skills and reactive tracking, strangely also smoothness. Don't get me wrong, training smoothness is extremely important, but it's not the answer to every problem. The primary indicator for smoothness problems is if you're tracking a target with a semi-auto gun for a few seconds and you notice a lot of jitter, where your crosshair keeps falling off the target. Next is getting too caught up on the exact sensitivity multiplier you should use when training smoothness. I get this question all the time. There's really two main reasons why you would want to increase your sensitivity. One is to make smooth tracking more difficult. Why does it become more difficult? That leads into the second reason, because when you increase your sens, you're naturally going to use more of your wrist and fingertips to control the mouse. If you look at the composition of your arm, the larger muscle groupings, nerves, tendons, more associated with stability are closer to your shoulder. The smaller ones, more associated with control, are closer to your wrist. This is just science. If you're facing a predictable moving target, then using more of your upper arm and shoulder will make your shots more reliable. So you would want to increase your sensitivity to intentionally develop the muscles and nerves in your wrist that are required for aim. Next is not smoothly reacting back. If I had to name the most difficult problem aimers face and FPS players in general, it would be their inability to smoothly react to targets changing direction. Hell, I suffer from this problem to this day. I don't think it's ever something you can completely solve, because in FPS games you deal with a lot of unique strafe patterns, movement prediction, and hand interdependence, which are naturally at odds with developing smoothly reacting. So I think this is just something you need to always be aware of and try to minimize. As I mentioned before, smooth thin strafes, also known as needle track strafing in Aimlab, is probably the best scenario to train on for focusing this. But generically, any smooth tracking scenario with some amount of reactivity, and especially variable strafe patterns like VSS scenarios in kovaaks, they're excellent for focusing on this. Over predicting, this is probably the most common problem people have when doing smooth tracking, especially when they're starting out. It's counterintuitive, sort of like patting your head and rubbing your stomach at the same time, but it's something if you consciously think about while you are training and working on eliminating it, over time you'll improve at it. Similar to the smooth reacting problem, this is a problem that will continue to show up throughout all your aim journeys, so just be aware of it when it's happening and then force yourself not to do it. And now we've reached the end of our smooth tracking journey. Make sure to invest time in the scenarios and routines that we talked about, and you too will be able to one-clip people in games. Next up in the foundational aim series will be evasive target switching, which requires a good amount of smooth tracking, so get your practice in now before we move on to that topic. I'll see you next time.